Oh, cue background noise. Fifi, you gonna wander the apartment? Nola, you got your squeaky toy? You know what, I think the flowers behind me are dying. Just looking at them through the viewfinder, they look to be kind of dead. I think I'm gonna move them. And note to self, get some new greenery for the set. Get some new greenery for set. What else is back there? I don't even want to know. There's like a pill bottle. Oh my god. That's for the dogs, I swear. Never paid so much attention to what's hanging out on the top of the sideboard until now. Everyone, it's me, Jess. How you doing? I'm here to talk about my rankings of the books that I read for Group D in the Octofinals of the BookTube Prize. On April 1st, the rankings were announced, and I struggled with this. Oh, and just an update on what's happening for this round in terms of my involvement. I put my name in to be considered, but the computer chose other people. It didn't end up choosing my name, so I'm off the hook. I'm not reading the books for the BookTube Prize this round, and I'm happy to give other people the opportunity to participate. I think it's good to have lots of people participating and lots of extra spots. I'm really happy that there are so many people participating. I am on standby in case anybody has to drop out for whatever reason, because life does happen. I'll be continuing to put my name up as a volunteer as the rounds move forward to the eventual finals. So I wanted to talk about my rankings and the way that I approached the rankings and what I thought of the books that I read. The first thing that I want to mention is that I had already read The Bee Sting back in the fall. And I did not go ahead and reread The Bee Sting because it's quite a long book. I already loved it. So I guess I went in sort of trying to see, I mean, in some ways, I guess I went in biased, but I went in just sort of reading these books to try and not so much measure them against The Bee Sting, but I did want to see. In the end, you end up having to compare these books to each other. They're in a grouping together. It would be absolutely impossible, I think, to say that I just evaluated these books objectively because I read them together. They're in the same grouping. You decide whether three move on, which three in the grouping move on to the next round. So it's impossible not to make comparisons. So with that in mind, I guess I already had my experience of reading The Bee Sting, which I didn't feel at all conflicted about because it was fairly recent. I read it in September. I mean, I realize that's like 6 months, but I feel like The Bee Sting made such a major impression on me, and I was so immersed in that book because it is the type of book that you have to immerse yourself in. But I didn't feel like I had any trouble remembering it or remembering what I loved about it. So I was okay not reading it. I don't know all the rules. Hopefully that's okay. I went ahead and I dove in. I actually bought, okay, before I get into that, I should say the books that were in my grouping were The Bee Sting by Paul Murray, Faster Wilds by Lauren Groff, which I just made a blog about, Loved and Missed by Susie Boyt, Old God's Time by Sebastian, Big Swiss by Jen Beagan, and Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane. So I was able to get Small Mercies out rather quickly from the library. I had also had to wait quite a while to get Faster Wilds out of the library. So I would say that I read these books over the 6-week period. I tried to read 2 or 3 going at the same time. I started out with Old God's Time and Big Swiss and Small Mercies, and then I moved on to Loved and Missed and The Faster Wilds. I have no idea if the order in which I read these books had an influence. I really tried not to let that have an influence. I was also reading other books at the same time. So not to get too heavy into process, but yes, those are the circumstances. So all this to say that I didn't read them cover to cover by themselves, which is how I normally read books. I don't normally sit down and read one book cover to cover on its own. Sometimes, occasionally that will happen, but usually I'm reading 3, 4, 5 books at the same time. There's nothing unusual in my reading behavior. I didn't change anything in my reading behavior to read the books for the BookTube Prize. Let's get into my rankings. I'm going to start with the book that I ranked the lowest and move up to the book that I ranked the highest. The book that I ranked at the lowest was Old God's Time by Sebastian. Don't know. I wanted to like this book. I thought the premise of the story was going to be really interesting. So for those of you that don't know anything about Old God's Time, I think one of the issues, because I didn't know anything about Old God's Time except for the bits that I'd heard around BookTube, around the booker. And I had heard, and even the back, synopsis on the back reads, Tom Kettle, a retired policeman and widower, has his solitude interrupted when 2 former colleagues turn up at his door to ask about a decades-old case. And so from the outset, it's set up as if this is going to be a murder mystery. I'm not saying that it was necessarily sold as a murder mystery or billed as a murder mystery, but I thought that that was going to be a significant part of the story. Okay, so here's where I'm going to get to why. It's not so much that I didn't get what I was anticipating, which I didn't, by the way. It's that, so it is true that the book starts out this way, with 2 young policemen knocking on Tom Kettle's door. And it's true that he invites them in. But in the process of that, we also have detail about the food that he makes and serves them, and we're in his head, and it's a stream of consciousness, and it's his thoughts about them and why they're there, and immediately I found it to be very disorienting to be in this character's head. So from the beginning I knew I was going to have a hard time with it, because already I was struggling quite a bit with the stream of consciousness, because the way that the stream of consciousness is written is it lacks focus. And maybe that does represent the way an aging mind works. But as a reader, that is a very challenging thing to ask, I think, of the reader, to follow this person's mind. And I had a lot of difficulty with it. I knew that I was going to have to kind of give it the benefit of the doubt in the hopes that the story would be compelling enough as we moved further along in the story. So this stream of consciousness was very, very hard to follow. I don't know. I didn't find, it's going to sound like I'm bashing this book, but I'm really not bashing this book, because I thought that there were some points in the story that were very touching, that were very moving, but I found following the main character's stream of consciousness thoughts very, very challenging as a reader, and they were so meandering. And so the thoughts they were often disconnected thoughts, and the thinking was remembering, so going back in the past, and I didn't even feel like very much of it was in the actual present moment, which is maybe true for most people's minds, but not great for storytelling, and not great, I didn't think, as my experience as a reader. In addition to that, the plot itself I don't think we got any real plot development until maybe like almost halfway into the book. That might be an exaggeration, but a lot of it is flashbacks, and there's a lot of alluding to different things, and there is a plot, and everything is tied together by the end of the story. But I found the pacing, the combination of the very slow pacing of the plot and the stream of consciousness, there's no real distinction between when we're in his past or when we're in the present. And in addition, there's some mystical elements. Maybe he's imagining some of these events, or he's misremembering some of these events. I really wanted to like this book, but when I was given the task of ranking them for the BookTube Prize, I really felt like this was the least interesting and the least accessible of the books in the grouping. I think it's a tough read. It's not for everyone. And then the actual content, the material of the book is quite dark. I think you're asking a lot of the reader to already be presenting very dark topics and not necessarily giving very much structure to the story. And so for those two things to be combined, I thought it was not great. was not a great read. So I think that in the end, the effect that this had for me, on me as a reader, is that a lot of times while I was reading, I really felt like his stream of consciousness, the thinking, the way it was presented on the page was almost incoherent. And it started to really bother me. I stuck with it for the sake of the BookTube Prize, but I really didn't enjoy reading it. And the payoff in terms of the plot twist, because there is a plot twist, I didn't think that it was a big enough plot twist to really compensate, I guess, for the style of the writing, which I don't think was successful. I think there were pacing problems. I think that the style didn't work for me, and the plot, like I said, it wasn't interesting enough. He didn't have enough main plot points, especially early on in the book, to help the reader stick with the style of writing. And so for that reason, I had to rank it the lowest in the grouping. I think I should say also that it does deal with the abuse of children in the Catholic Church. And it does deal with those topics early enough on in the book, but not in the sense that those topics it's not structured so that the topics are presented as part of the plot. I mean, not in enough of a significant way, I didn't feel, to merit the too rambling, too disconnected, too unclear. There were lots of different moments where I didn't understand what the relevance was of different characters or different scenes to the story. And I don't think that that's a good thing, honestly, when you're reading a story. The book that I ranked in 5th place was Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane. And when I read this book, it had the absolute opposite effect on me as Old God's Time, in that I literally flew through this book. It was so fast-paced, almost too fast-paced. I almost have the opposite criticism of Small Mercies, in that it was go, 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 go. And there were a lot of action scenes in this novel, which I don't mind, but I started to get a little bit bored of the repetition of these action sequences that were included in the novel. Small Mercies is set in the summer of 1974 against the backdrop of the desegregation of Boston's school system, where they had a program to bus Black kids into schools in working class white neighborhoods. And I thought that that part of the story was really interesting, and it gave a good sense of place and time to the story. We follow a group of characters living in Southie, which is the Irish American housing district for really working class Irish American families. In particular, we follow a woman named Mary Pat Fennessy. So the book opens with Mary Pat talking to her daughter, who is heading out for the evening, and she does not come back to her house, and Mary Pat begins to wonder what happened to her daughter. The same night, a young man is murdered in the subway. We come to learn that I don't want to give too much of the plot away, but we come to learn that her daughter is involved in that incident, and it all unravels as to what happened to her daughter, but not without significant effort and perseverance by Mary Pat. And the character of Mary Pat is a wonderful character, such a strong woman. So she has so much grit and so much determination and she's so tough. I thought her character was well formed and very interesting, and I was reading it almost to see her get answers, to get vengeance, which is the second part of the book is mostly about her getting vengeance. There were some really interesting characters in the mix along the way, but ultimately I just felt like the story read as a very commercial book. There was a lot of this action a lot of these action scenes that were very well executed. I think somebody said in the comments when I was saying I was going to read this book, and I can't get that out of my head now, it was a lot like reading like a movie script almost, and I feel like it was. I thought it had a great plot. These action scenes were very well crafted, but I just was really only there for Mary Pat, and I didn't feel connected so much emotionally to her as a character. It was more the fact that she was a tough-ass bitch that I really liked, and I really thought that the neighborhood and the combination of the characters in the neighborhood did give you a really strong sense of that neighborhood at that time. I thought that that was really, really well done. Was it as well done as an author like Colson Whitehead? I didn't feel like it was enough for me to rank it higher than the other books that I'd read. I don't know. It's like my lowest ranked book was like, I'm too much in this character's head and it's too confusing. And then the other book was like, I'm not getting enough of the character's emotions and I'm not feeling as connected to the characters. So it's a little bit hard to say. And the one in 6th place was the pacing was not great, and the one in the 5th place was like the pacing was very, very good. You know, I guess I had a lot of problems with Old God's Time, and I felt like Small Mercies was a great, fun read, but that it wasn't particularly special in any particular way. Oh my gosh, I've read something really fantastic here that doesn't come along that often. But I would recommend it. I thought it was really good. I enjoyed it, and it was a nice break because it was a little less taxing to read. Just a really good page turner that puts you into a situation, and there are lots of twists and turns to the plot as well. So it's definitely like a revenge drama, and I think that that's not necessarily for everyone. I enjoyed it, but I just think that's a very simplistic kind of a plot, and I knew about halfway in that there really wasn't anywhere more interesting than that the book was going to take me, and in that way it was a little bit disappointing because I think that there could have been some more interesting things introduced into the story. That I'm not a writer, so I won't say, but I do think that there was something simplistic about the story. So although it was a really good read, there was something about the story that was a little bit flat. It felt a little bit commercial, a little bit like stereotypical, and I didn't think that he took the opportunity to explore some of the other dynamics between blacks and whites as well as he could have. He did a little bit, but not in any more than you would very superficially for something that would fit into like a 2-hour movie, for example. So for that reason, I ranked it in 5th place. Then I started to really struggle because I knew that the next decision would be the difference between a book going on to the final round and a book not going on to the final round. And the last 4 books in the grouping, I really, really, really enjoyed. And so it was really difficult for me to move on from there in terms of figuring out my rankings. But decisions had to be made. So I will say that in 4th place, and some people might not be very happy with me for this, but in 4th place, I ranked Lauren Groff's The Vaster Wilds. I enjoyed reading The Vaster Wilds, but I read The Matrix last fall, and I did not enjoy The Vaster Wilds as much as I enjoyed The Matrix. I thought that it just was a bit slow for me. I talked about this in a recent vlog because I did read this as the last book for the BookTube Prize Rankings, and we're following this young girl who's run away from colonial settlement because of death, and that the deaths are either from starvation or they're from plague. I couldn't tell. I should have maybe checked more carefully. They don't know. I think I looked it up and there's no conclusive information about the actual colonial settlement that this is based on, how everybody died. It says that like 80% of colonialists died of disease or starvation or a combination of both. So that's what I figure happened. Although we can tell that this character is very brave, she's very courageous, she's quite young. There's something about the adventure that she goes on where she throws herself out into the wilderness aimlessly, knowing that she's running away from this colonial settlement because of this child. This child dies, and we don't know whether this child Bess dies, and we don't know whether we don't know what the girl's involvement is with the child's death, and we don't know exactly why she's running away. I guess we're led to believe that there's more than that and that there's a reason. So she has some flashbacks to various different times in her life, which I actually found a little bit confusing. At first, it's flashback to a time when she was orphaned, then it's flashback to a time when she was on a ship and she met a man, and then it flashes back to before they came over from England because her master was like a goldsmith, and at that point she's named. She has a number of names throughout the book. I think it would have been a good idea to name her. I think that would have helped with the story. And some things happen to her out in the wilderness. She's very resourceful, but I just kept thinking, like, I'm just reading about this girl in the wilderness, and at one point she has a voice in her head that speaks back to her, which I thought more was going to be done with that idea. There are a number of moments where we know that there are indigenous men who know that she's in the forest, but they don't approach her. I don't know. I was expecting this to be better, and I also felt like I was wanting something to happen for too much of the time that I was reading the book. And I'd be reading a chapter and I think, oh, something's going to happen in this chapter. And she finds some eggs. Or she finds a frozen fish. A lot of it was, I guess, about finding food, but it just wasn't enough for me. It wasn't enough for me to build a whole entire novel out of. I feel like it just was a little bit too plotless. It was really plotless. And although that can be really interesting, and I think if she played a little bit more with the girl's backstory, if it was better integrated, if it was better explained, and if we went deeper into her backstory, and if some of the reason for her intuitiveness or some of the experiences that she had with her intuitiveness in the forest were a little bit more pronounced, then I think that I would have enjoyed it a lot more. And so ultimately, when I had to think about the rankings relative to the other books, I couldn't bring myself to put it in the top 3. I saw that it went through, and I'm happy that it went through because I definitely liked this book. I thought it was good, but I liked the other books in the grouping better. Anyway, if you want to see more about my experience reading The Vaster Wilds or hear more about my experience reading it, you can check out the vlog that I made. But I found the story had too much repetition of her making her way in the woods over and over and over again without enough. I just didn't think that those stories, I thought that that's story, if you were going to use it as the backbone of the entire novel, as opposed to her backstory and what happened to her in her past, which we only got small snippets of, I think that you would need to make it more interesting. I did not find it compelling enough the way it was written. I enjoyed it, but I just didn't find, it was one of those books where I feel like this was a whole novel when there wasn't enough there to write a whole novel. It wasn't enough of a story. Okay, so now we get into the books that I ranked in the top 3. I had already read The Bee Sting. I would not have read the other 2 books if it wasn't for the BookTube Prize, and I'm so glad that I did. I thought Big Swiss, I didn't think I was going to like this book, and I thought for sure going in, like I had preconceived notions about which rankings would be where. I'm sorry, my battery is running out, so I might have to come back on and finish this in a lower light. So I didn't know how I would feel about this book. I thought I was going to rank it fairly low, and in the end, I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was very creative, very original, very funny, a little bit quirky, maybe a little too quirky. For some people, I can completely see that. So our main character, Greta, lives with an older woman, Sabine, who's a great character. She's an older woman in her 50s, very eccentric, in a house that's kind of a little bit dilapidated. She works as a transcriber for this guy named Ohm, who does these kind of pseudo-therapeutic sessions with people. And one of the clients of his, she nicknames Big Swiss. She kind of falls for Big Swiss through the transcription of the sessions that Big Swiss has with Ohm, and then they end up meeting in real life. There are a lot of scenes set in dog parks, which is really fun. We learn a lot about Greta, and she has a lot of issues, and I was totally there for that. She wasn't completely, I didn't think she was completely unhinged, although she definitely crossed a lot of ethical boundaries by getting involved with, oh, I'm using my vlogging camera, it's a little crooked. it was either that or my iPhone. It's the first time my batteries run out when I've been talking about books. Anyway, so where did I leave off? I have no idea, but I think I was trying to remember Big Swiss's real name, which is Flavia. Greta sort of crosses the line by falling in love with Big Swiss, and they meet in person, and they are both kind of, I'm just going to pull you a little bit closer to me so that the video has kind of aesthetic as it did before. But I must say, I found this to be very, very enjoyable, and I thought I would really dislike the whole woman unhinged vibe because I've already read Mona Awad's books and I have a little bit of trouble with Ottessa Moshfegh. Like, I don't always enjoy her books, and when I heard this book being compared to those two, I automatically thought I would really not enjoy it, and I was happily surprised. I thought that this had a lot of merit. It was funny. It presented a lot of the issues that women face generally, but also women at different stages of their life and in different circumstances. I just thought it was hilarious, and I really, really enjoyed it. I thought there were moments in this book that were really, really sweet. There were moments of where Greta is quite close to being vulnerable that were really sweet, and I thought I would be turned off because I had heard that there was a lot of sex in the book, and honestly I wasn't really too bothered by those parts of the book. Did they contribute to the book? I don't know. I think that the book would have been just as good with those parts having been left out, but I can appreciate that they were there for entertainment value, and I didn't have an issue with it. I preferred the first parts of the book where it was mostly her transcribing these sessions, because I really thought that that idea of voyeurism was really interesting, and she wrote it really well. She wrote the dialogue really, really well in those sections of the book. I enjoyed that part of the book a lot more than when she came out and started writing sort of the regular chapters, and this is what happened and this is how the story went sort of idea. I was really happily surprised by this, and in the same way that I was kind of disappointed with The Vaster Wilds, I was really happily surprised by this. So I ended up putting it in third place in my rankings. That being said, I do think that towards the end of the book, it became a lot more reflective, a lot more thoughtful, and a little bit more emotional, and a little bit more moving. And I would say for me, the thing that pushed it over the edge of this one and the other two books is that I thought that the characterizations in this book were so good and so well done. And I thought that the book had something to offer in terms of offering something unique and different, and I found it to be very well written and very funny and very engaging. I didn't feel like it had any pacing problems. I didn't feel like it was boring. I didn't feel like I didn't understand why this was included in the book, which are all things that I felt about the previous three books. Putting it in third place because I think even objectively, I think that's where it needed to be. Obviously, that's where I thought it needed to be because that's where I ranked it. So now you'll know that I'm going to talk about when I talk about the next book, you'll know what my rankings were. In the end, I did rank The Bee Sting in first place. I still think that it is the best of these 6 books. I think it's one of the better books that I read last year, even though I didn't include it in my top 10. I just read a lot of really, really good books last year, and in my top 10 books of the year, it really was my favorite books of the year. Even though I thought The Bee Sting was so fantastic, it wasn't one of my favorite books of the year. But anyway, all of that being said, in second place, and there were moments where I really wanted to put this in first place, but I felt like it might have been just a little bit too emotional. Like, I was trying to think about books that were a little bit more accessible for everyone, and I don't know if that's a fair way to think about ranking things for prizes. And I'm really excited to watch other people's videos and see what they think about how you rank books. If I had to pick a book in the grouping that I loved the most, it would be a really hard toss-up between The Bee Sting and this book. I would say, like, I love them both equally. But I couldn't put them both in first place. Loved and Missed had to come in second place. I never would have read Loved and Missed by Susie Boyt. I never would have read this book if it wasn't for the BookTube Prize. And I looked and it had such a small number of reviews on Goodreads, I was really surprised. So I'm just so happy that this book is getting a little bit more acknowledgement and recognition. This book broke my freaking heart. It was so sad, and it was very, very relatable to me. It's about this woman, Ruth, whose daughter, Eleanor, she's living a life of addiction. She's living with this man. They end up having a child, but what happens is they're not really able to take care of the child because of their addiction problems. And so Ruth ends up raising the child. And it's just so painful because Ruth loves her daughter, but she doesn't want to, like, she's too removed from her to be able to do more than just be so grateful when she can actually see her and spend time with her. And Eleanor kind of scoffs her off, and it's a really heartbreaking dynamic. And then, like, she doesn't want her mom involved in her life, Eleanor. And then the dynamic between Ruth and Lily, who is her grandchild, is so sweet, and Lily's such a great character. And then there's all of this sadness about her mother, and then I won't get into the more sad part because something else happens that's extremely sad. And I did mark up different parts of the book, but because this is a wrap-up for the BookTube Prize, I'm not going to read anything. But when I do my wrap-up for the month of March, I will probably maybe read some sections of this book. I'm not sure. I marked up a bunch of things because they were really moving passages. But this book is just it was so emotional and so good. And I think for a writer to be able to take this topic and look at it from the perspective of the removed parent and the caretaker, someone who's got a real caretaker nature to them, which Ruth does, and who doesn't want conflict and wants to be able to keep her daughter close and keep her grandchild close. It just was a very moving book, and I found that the way that it was written was very beautiful and very moving. Not beautiful in the sense of it was so poetic, it's just that she writes these little scenes and these little vignettes that are just like, oh, they're so they really pull at your heartstrings. They're very touching. You can feel all the emotion that this woman has in the way that she's written in this story. And I thought that that was just something unique, something that I haven't seen, that you don't see very often. And I really thought it was amazing. I thought it was such a good book. And so I had to put it in second place. I did put it in second place behind The Bee Sting. Honestly, not for any real reason except just that I felt like The Bee Sting was a little bit more, it has more access points for more people, potentially, because this story is very specifically a woman's story, and it's very specifically about being a single parent or a single grandparent caretaker. I don't know, I think at the end, maybe I didn't have the courage to put it in the first spot against The Bee Sting. I'm not sure. But I really, really loved it, and I really, really loved The Bee Sting, and if I could have put them both in first place, I would have, but I had to make a choice. But I will say it is quite a harrowing read. Like, the tears were cried. There were tears and tears and tears. I think people should read this book. I hope people read this book. I hope people pick it up. It's quiet. It's not show-offy. It's a little bit understated. It's almost like those small moments of life, which are a lot of the moments that are detailed in the book, which it's like those are the only moments that Ruth has to hold on to. I could just gush and go on, and I will talk about it a little bit more in my March wrap-up, but I just can't believe how good this book was, and I'm so happy that I found it as a result of reading for the BookTube Prize, which is exactly what I was hoping for when I signed up for this. So now we come to The Bee Sting. I will link the video in which I originally talked about The Bee Sting here in the cards and below. The Bee Sting is a family saga told from the different points of view of the 4 members of this family, and it takes place in Ireland, and it's just after, I believe, the 2008 financial crisis. So each of the members of the family has an opportunity to have a voice in the novel, and their different stories are told from their perspectives. That's Dickie and Imelda, the father and mother of PJ and Cass. Cass is on her way to Trinity College, and PJ is 12 years old and likes to, he's getting into all kinds of different, kind of getting himself into trouble, feeling a little bit neglected. The main story though is about Dickie and I guess Imelda, although I've heard people say like everyone likes the book because of liking different stories. I have heard the book be criticized for the child character isn't very well written or the characters aren't very well balanced, but I found it to be, I found that the characters, PJ's character especially, I really felt for, and I found everything in the book pretty believable. It was a mess. They're all kind of on the brink of what would be sort of falling apart, the parents especially. And so in some ways this is it's a very depressing book, but I felt like it was very true to real life. And the only thing that I think people might have a difficult time with, there are two things about this book that I think people might have a really hard time with that I think are more legitimate. One is that Imelda's story is written in a stream of consciousness style that doesn't have correct punctuation, and that threw me off a little bit as well. But I would say what Paul Murray does, the choices that he made, if you compare, for example, to a book like Old God's Time, is that he made the choice to have Imelda's story come quite a bit later in the book. He starts out with Cass's story, which I really enjoyed. It's about her in her literature classes and the dynamic between her and her parents, and the parents are introduced and her brother are all introduced. And then he moves into the stream of consciousness section, and I knew about the section ahead of time, and so I think I was comfortable with it. So the stream of consciousness really didn't affect me. I didn't love it, but it didn't affect me in the same way because I knew that it was only for a temporary amount of time. And I thought that her stream of consciousness was a little bit more, I don't know, cohesive, I guess. So the other thing about The Bee Sting that definitely means that it should have ranked higher than Loved and Missed, and the more that I talk about it, the more I realize that it's really true that The Bee Sting needed to be first, is that it was just, it had a lot of dark humor, it had a lot of irony. Although it was kind of a tragic story, it was very funny in parts, and it was very entertaining in parts, and the characters were really super well developed, and it was very plotty. There is plot in this story, and it manages the little vignettes in the storytelling in a way that's really, really poignant. So it's hard not to be drawn into the experiences of the characters. The Bee Sting had a story, there was a plot, there were a lot of secrets that were kept by, especially by the parents, from one another. They made decisions that they maybe regretted, and they had these messy lives, and they were living in difficult times. You know, Dickie was trying to run his father had owned a business, and he took over the business, and he was trying to run it in these kind of really difficult financial circumstances. So it was like a dark comedy, and it had a good plot, and there were a lot of twists and turns. There were moments, he was so good at managing writing tension. There were moments in that book where I was like holding my breath because I didn't know what was going to happen, and I was nervous for the characters. And I just think that all of those things coming in the full package. Part from the mother's perspective, Imelda, that was written in stream of consciousness, is one thing that I think people could legitimately say was problematic with the book. And the other thing that I think maybe people would have a problem with would have been the ending of the book. I myself had no issue with the ending of the book. I liked the ending, but I can see that some people might have had a problem with the way the book ended, which of course I'm not going to tell you here and now. You just have to go and read The Bee Sting if you haven't read it already. So those are my thoughts on the BookTube Prize, and that's some insight into how I went about ranking the book. Would I go back and change anything? No. I think I really put a lot of effort, thought, and consideration into the rankings. I know that people are going to have different ideas. I've already watched a couple of videos where people talk about these books. They had different opinions from me, and I think that that's okay, and that is why you have, I think, 11 judges judging each grouping of the books, and their ratings are average. And so, for example, Big Swiss did not pull through, and The Vaster Wilds did pull through, and I'm perfectly okay with that. I think that that's perfectly fine. I am just beyond happy that Loved and Missed has gone on to the next round, because I think it definitely deserved it. I think I would have been very disappointed if The Bee Sting hadn't gone through to this next round. So those are my thoughts. I'm gonna sign off for now. The dog is responding to the neighbors coming home. I will save you from his barking annoyance, and I will say bye for now. I'll see you in the next video. Everybody, I apologize. Oh, Nola. Oh God, okay. And I really loved the bee sting. Whoop. Sorry, I'm getting a call, hang on. Hello?
Hi.
Hi, what's up? Oh, her name was Lamentations or Zed. I just thought it was a bit, I would have liked for her to have had a name. Mary Pat has just, Nola, no barking.